Good.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your attendance today. It's wonderful we have folks that are interested in the possible density growth in Nantucket and today in Madaket in particular. Madaket Conservation Association was very pleased when Nantucket Land Council's Emily Molden and ACKNow's Julia Linder embraced the idea of looking at density growth from a different angle. We're pleased that that went forward, and thanks to Principal Group for doing the study. Thanks to NCTV for making this presentation today possible. Plus, they're recording it so that folks that couldn't make it today will be able to view it in the future. So, once again, thank you for taking the time to join us, and we're sure that this is going to, this presentation today will start some conversation that's very germane and necessary to have about the future of Nantucket. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Emily Molden. I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Council. And I would just want to echo Bill's sentiment of thanks for folks tuning in this afternoon. We were really excited to team up with the Madaket Conservation Association and also with assistance from ACKNow to take a look at this important issue. The area of Madaket has been designated as a needs area for town sewer, and that's really a result of declining water quality and the health of Madaket's waters over the years. Sewer, or wastewater management, I should say, is certainly not the only issue implicating the waters in Madaket, but it's definitely a major one. It's not a unique issue to Nantucket. Many of us are familiar with the fact that a lot of communities over on the Cape have also been struggling with wastewater management. In fact, Nantucket Island has done a much better job in its history in sewering parts of the community than a lot of areas on the Cape have been able to. We're certainly supportive of improving water quality in Madaket, and that has to be a priority for the health of the residents there and of the island, and sewer is an important component of that. But the folks in Madaket had some questions, as did we, about what kind of implications bringing sewer would have to Madaket and its ongoing development and redevelopment into the future. So we were really pleased to be able to hire folks from the Principal Group, planning and design firm, to take a closer look at what the implications would be of eliminating the bedroom restrictions that are associated with septic systems, on-site waste disposal systems, and bringing sewer out to Madaket. So with us today, I'm very pleased to introduce is Russel Preston. He is the one of the founders and directors of Principal. Principal is a planning and a design firm. Russel himself has over 20 years of experience with both public and private projects, regionally and nationally. He serves on Boston's Air Pollution Control Commission and so has a lot of exposure and experience with climate change related issues. And he's also spent over 8 years working on projects on Cape Cod. So he also has a lot of familiarity with a lot of the water quality issues that we are dealing with here on Nantucket and in Madaket as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Russel to talk a little bit about the analysis that Principal did for us of development potential in Madaket.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to just sort of walk around a little bit and stand up because there's a lot of maps. I might want to point to stuff, so bear with me. But it's great to be here. I was really pleased to be able to come to the island and talk to you all about this issue and what we've discovered over the work we've done together. And big thanks to Emily and to Julia and to everyone in the Madaket community who's spent time with us on Zoom and in meetings, kind of going through this discussion. So what we've discovered, we're going to kind of walk through how we got to that and then kind of talk about some of the thoughts we've had about, okay, what do you do next? Principal is a kind of multidisciplinary firm that we focus on helping folks create authentic places that will stand the test of time. So we have planners, designers, architects, real estate folks, data scientists, sort of all working together to think about how your community can become what it wants to be and look to the future. And we find that a lot of it is about the people. So I think with COVID going on while we were doing this study, we really tried to kind of interact as much as we could on Zoom. But it's really about what your community wants for its future is one of the big questions we always ask. And in talking with Emily in the beginning of this project, we recognized the water quality issues. I was aware of them from our work on the Cape, and kind of could see that Madaket has an interesting geography to it too, and how it's interacting with the rest of the island, and also just trying to understand how could sewer, what are the implications of sewer at a place-based level, meaning like looking at the land use, looking at the buildings, and the way people interact with each other. And it was sort of say, well, let's just look at, once we take away the restrictions that the septic regulations has on single-family lots and on the lots and buildings in Madaket, what happens? So, when we look at Madaket, there is a character there. There's a way that all the buildings sit on the land. There's a way that you interact with the landscape. There's a way people use the streets that are around there. There are aspects of your community that I think folks were starting to question: is the sewer going to have an unintended consequence to disrupt those if we're not careful? And this is something that we see a lot, where infrastructure projects might be a road or a bike path or a highway or a train line. They are very rarely really thought about cohesively between the land use and that infrastructure. So if you think of the sewer as the infrastructure, how does it interact with the land use, and are those symbiotic with where you want to go long term as a community? I think this sort of starts to suggest, what are your values around the ongoing development or ongoing changes that might come to Madaket, and how do you want to manage those? So as you see here on this slide, depending on the type of situation that might occur, and this is a maximum build out. We essentially looked at every parcel throughout the neighborhood and said, how would it be affected with or without sewer? How would it be affected if essentially a two-story build out of a parcel happened? Or how would it be affected if a three-story build out, meaning there was some potential for basement additions and the like. And you can see there, it's, with a two-story build out, you're 1.7, almost 1.8 times as many bedrooms as you are today. And then, with the potential for basement bedrooms, you're almost at 2.5 times the number of bedrooms you are today. Now that's a full build out. And I think when we look at this, when we often do these planning build out scenarios, they're sort of the beginning of our research for larger neighborhood planning work or larger zoning work that we're doing. And we sort of look at it and say, well, what is that zoning taking the community where it wants to go? And that's a question we always kind of start with. And it comes down to, how do we, zoning is this tool we have that as humans, it's one of the few tools we have to predict the future. It's the instructions for how your community will physically be built over time. So what we did is say, okay, well, what is going to be the results once you remove the sewer? So we developed a series of modeling sort of algorithms and geospatial analysis for this. It started really with the zoning map and kind of working backwards from there, as well as the constraints around wetlands and the relationship to the natural environment. So you've got, this is sort of the percentage of breakdown of your zoning districts in Madaket. And largely you'll see that the VR district takes up a substantial amount more of the land, but each zoning district is affected in one way, in one type of way. And when you look at them, so one of the main things was sort of the inputs were making some assumptions about the types of approvals a project would get if they were to go and be built. So we tried to kind of unify our assumptions around what the potential of each zoning would allow. And I think that's where this is a modeling exercise where, some special permits we assumed would happen just based on habit and discussion with the folks on the team. And those could change, and the outputs of this modeling would change with it. So in the report, you'll see that a lot of our assumptions are documented, as well as the workflow, how we actually did this. It was important to us to try and sort of daylight that as much as possible, so if folks wanted to replicate it, they could, or that it was understood how the methodology of really understanding the relationship between the sewer and the zoning code. We also took into account a number of the constraints around wetlands and setbacks into that. So this is at the parcel level. So this sort of set up the kind of study area. Some parcels were not included, others were, based on the criteria of sort of how they were affected. And then where are you at today? You're at 1,600 bedrooms based on the data that we analyzed. And then one of the key assumptions was, well, okay, if we're equating sort of sewer flow and septic flow, the sort of module we're using is bedrooms. So we had to come up with some metric that established, well, how much square footage is a bedroom? So we know we could translate from the zoning sort of maximum build of a parcel to, well, how many bedrooms is that based on a gross floor area of a building or a home? And we looked historically at kind of the bedroom sizes. And it was funny, when we started this work, I sort of guessed, well, maybe it's 825 square feet gross per household, just kind of looking at sort of trends and kind of the residential market over the decades. And when we looked at the data here for Nantucket, 847 gross square feet per bedroom. So that allowed us to establish volume of new development and then convert that to bedrooms. This is a simplified version of how we sort of built this model and the steps we take with the data inputs and then how we got to the mapping that was in the report. So we looked at really two big scenarios. The build out at 2 stories, and this is additional build out today with septic. And I think this is, just anecdotally we've heard from a number of folks that the septic is really a limiting factor for Madaket, for an addition, for all the sorts of things that folks might want to do with their property. When the sewer comes, that constraint largely goes away. And what I realized when we saw these maps the first time, I said, well, it's not just one zoning district, it's all the zoning districts. So that means there's potential for your aspects of your entire community to change over time. And I think that's where it sort of was like, okay, that's worth talking about, because it could result slowly. It's not going to happen in a year or two, but over time, more and more and more of your neighborhood might change. And there's at a certain point in time, and we've seen this when we've done work in other seaside communities, is at a certain point you're going to realize it's not the character that it used to be. And it's changed enough significantly that it's not the place that I loved or that I might want my grandkids to love. And I think that's the thing we wanted to point out to you, is that there's the potential for significant change to occur, and how quickly that is and how long that takes is a variable that really is dynamic. But it's worth talking about. When you add in the sort of difference, you see that there are some parcels, the larger parcels and all, there's some parcels that have great development potential, regardless of sewer or septic. But when you just, when you take those off the table and say, well, what new development is potential, with the sewer, it's still quite a bit. And it's a substantial amount, and it's not going to happen all at once, but it's that slow attrition of new and of changes that then eventually will maybe change Madaket. And the question I have for you all is, how do you want to direct that? What is the future for Madaket? And is this sort of coordination between the sewer and the zoning code correct for your community? So we were asked, after we did this sort of initial assessment, to look at what would happen if basements were included in the calculation. And initially we were trying to understand, well, how would we establish which parcels could or which parcels could not do this, with mean water level. And then it was just, sort of the team said, well, this is about the sort of the compelling reason that you want to spend time in Madaket, to be close to the ocean, to be close to the nature, to be in that environment, and the values there, people are going to want to, they'll figure out how to build in the basement. So we just said, well, let's just look at it neighborhood-wide and see if neighborhood-wide, what would be possible, if the cost of doing that was not a constraint. And you can see here, with just 3 stories, there's not many properties that can do that now with the current septic limitations, but there are quite a few that can do it once the sewer comes to Madaket. And then, again, there are some parcels that will have development in either scenario, but what we see when we remove those, is there's really quite a bit. There's enough here that the character of almost every single street has the potential to change. So it's almost 2.5 times the number of bedrooms that exist today. So when we look at the kind of comparison here, just sort of side by side, and with this kind of modeling, I like to think there's both science here and art. But when you pull way back and sort of say, is this the type of growth you want in your community? And what kind of form? If it is, then what's the form that makes sure that the future growth is compatible with the character and the things that you love about your community now? Or if it's not the kind of growth you want to see because it's going to result in potentially more vehicle trips and other impacts, well, then that means you have to do some more community planning discussions around that to establish a clearer vision for the future. And when we visualize this, and we try to look at this in a number of different ways, not just with maps, but in three dimensions, it's sort of, you can kind of see here the kind of general build out in Madaket now, and then you can start to see that it's almost every parcel that starts to have the potential for more bedrooms. And then with the basements included, there's a number of parcels that get substantially more impact with more bedrooms capable. So the other interesting thing here is about the kind of seasonality of Madaket and generally with the island. And you look at the census data here, and it's sort of, this is really a summertime issue or a seasonal issue at most, because how that many more people in Madaket, and how does that work with traffic? How does that work with services? And then conversely, what happens in the winter with a drastically reduced population? And so I think there's sort of a lot of community planning questions that came up for us when we were looking at this data. And I think it comes back to what's your long-term vision for Madaket and for the streets and the homes that you live near and around, and how can you come together as a community to say, we recognize that the sewer is an important environmental solution to the water quality. Now, how do we coordinate that so that the things that you love about Madaket remain there, or the things that you want to change are given clear direction in your zoning? And I think that's the main point that emerged for us, is that right now it's somewhat unpredictable what might happen given the infrastructure around sewer coming, and how much growth could happen, how quickly it could happen. And that's something as a community like yours you should have a better understanding of. So when we kind of were talking with everyone, we were really sort of pushed to say, well, what should we do next, and how should we plan for sewer in a way that is coordinated with your land use and your zoning? And part of it is what we call a neighborhood plan, and a lot of communities have done this, where it's sort of talking about establishing a long-term physical plan for your community. What do we want our streets to look like? What do we want homes to look like if they have additions, if they change, if they're raised and redeveloped? Sort of all the questions that that sort of guide how communities and how neighborhoods are built or change over time, or not changed, can be put into a neighborhood plan. The neighborhood plan then, of course, can then inform zoning. And I think, I mentioned this to Emily, I think every single one of our projects over the last 10 years, in some way, shape, or form, has struggled because of zoning. Whether the zoning was wrong, or the zoning wasn't right, or there was, there's always challenges around land use regulation. And I think this trend is not unique on Nantucket. This is throughout New England, all of our projects are having this issue. And part of it here is, I think, a misalignment between the values your community holds and what the physical results of those are, and what the zoning might allow to happen. And I think it's sort of bringing those in line, and there's a number of very direct, very clear ways of doing that with zoning. And then the third piece of this, and I think this goes back to the geography and the kind of the compelling landscape that's out there, is how do you get around? How do you sort of make it so if there is some growth, that it's the mobility and the ability to move around the neighborhood is coordinated with that? And I think that's a challenge with with the kind of one way in, one way out right now. So that's kind of the kind of high level where we've gone, what we've been doing. I think you all have fabulous sort of neighborhood that I think you have a number of people that are really passionate about caring for it. And I think that's something that hopefully this this work we've done together can start to kind of direct you on what questions you might need to answer next, and to prepare for a really impactful piece of infrastructure to come to help solve the water quality. And ideally, the other effects of that are better directed and better understood through this process. So thank you. And we should have a discussion now.
Thanks, Russell. I'll come sit over here behind a microphone. Yeah, appreciate that presentation and information. Certainly the analysis that Principal did took a lot longer than it took to present, that's for sure. But there certainly were some important assumptions that were made along the way. As Russell discussed, we wanted to take a look at the maximum potential for the area. Again, it's not something that we would ever envision happening overnight, but wanted that awareness. And as he said, we also thought it was really important to consider the implications of basements on these properties, because it's certainly something that we're seeing more and more around the island. So with those assumptions in mind, as Russell said, water quality is incredibly important and sewer is an important tool, but this was really all about considering other ways that sewer can change the way that a neighborhood and a community is developed, and making sure that the Madaket community and the island as a whole has this information as a tool to consider going forward. And yeah, I agree. I think it would be great if there's anyone here present with us that has any questions or comments, to have any sort of discussion. And I would just say that if you do, there's a couple of microphones, and since this is being recorded, it'd be great to step up to a microphone.
Hi, Russell. Leslie Forbes. I've seen these maps a lot of times, and I still need more information. Could you perhaps walk the audience through that particular map, which shows the additional for potential bedrooms, the colors, what the colors mean?
Right, right.
And maybe with one other map that
Yeah,
you think is
yeah, of
important,
course.
the one with the height
Of course.
is really...
So what we're trying to do here is visualize a very complicated thing, because every parcel might have, has different characteristics, different size, different, potentially even different setbacks depending on the zoning it's in. So what this map is trying to show is sort of across all the zoning districts, once we take into account the property's unique area and buildable potential, how many more bedrooms could be achieved. So the color gradient, the closer you get to purple, the more bedrooms a property can create. And there are some constraints in the zoning, based on coverage and sort of the volume that a home can create, based on that coverage amount and based on the height restrictions, sets up a total square footage that you might see in a home. And we've then looked at that, well, what's that total per parcel, and divided it by that average bedroom size. And that results in, well, what might happen in particular parcels. And it might be that, an existing home that is a 2 or 3 bedroom cottage now might be able to have a whole wing added, or it might be able to be taken down and rebuilt with a much larger home with many more bedrooms. So I think you see, as some of them that are darker orange or red might have slightly larger lots, or and then the ones that are more yellow, that's 3 or 4 bedrooms. So that might be that you're adding a wing to the house, or you're taking the house down and going from a 3 bedroom to a 7 or 8 bedroom home. So that's kind of the best way we could visualize this. The other way we visualized it, though, is sort of looking at it in sort of bar chart form. So what you see here is the existing bedrooms per parcel. So that's sort of the every parcel, how many bedrooms was in the data, and what the kind of current density of bedrooms is throughout Madaket. And then there's some sort of septic, the growth we've looked at that is attainable through septic. And you can see that, some of the parcels are underbuilt right now, or not developed to their full potential based on septic. So that's the yellow that you're seeing there. And then a big part of this was going parcel by parcel and looking at the conservation status of a parcel. Was it formerly conserved or had some covenant along it, so that those other parcels that have green on it are in some way conserved at this point in time. So then when we kind of go towards removing the septic and installing sewer throughout the neighborhood, and this is a build out, so it's every parcel is included, you can see there the sewer maximum growth. So some of these parcels can get a lot more growth, a lot more bedrooms. And that's what you're seeing here. And what is interesting to point out is, that means almost every house on a street might, in some way, shape, or form, be able to have an addition, have a side wing, a rear addition, or some other type of renovation that increases the number of beds or usable space in that parcel. So and that's sort of, some of them are more. Might have more potential than others, and going parcel by parcel by parcel, it's sort of there might be unique factors in each parcel that is unique to that parcel. So, but overall, that's how we've tried to visualize this, and this is just taking it to the rather than just 2 stories of growth, you get 3 stories of growth at each parcel. Does that make sense, Leslie? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you see the numbers, and bedrooms are important because with bedrooms comes volume.
Right,
Volume
right,
of the house.
right. I mean, this comes
Size of the
back.
house.
Yeah, this comes back, to mathematically calculating the potential volume that could go onto a parcel. And right now, with the septic that in place and the setbacks are required and the coverage and the flow rates, that it's capped. So you're essentially regulating density through wastewater treatment right now. Your septic systems are regulating the density for you. And what we find is that really good places that understand where they want to go, they're regulating density through zoning, more than relying on their septic and wastewater treatment to regulate density. And what I see here is because of that kind of that situation right now, the form that zoning is going to allow you to create is unpredictable right now. And I think that's sort of the big takeaway that I think everyone should go home with and think about is, when you walk down a street in Madaket, could every building get 1.75 times bigger or 2.5 times bigger because of the kind of potential growth that might be attainable depending on how they redevelop or renovate that parcel? Yeah, because we've got folks who are online. Hi, everyone at home.
Leslie Johnson, I'm a Madaket resident. Where does ground cover that's established for parcels come into play with that balance?
Yeah, this is taking into account, this is this is assuming the ground cover ratio, I think it's 10%, but it's different depending on the zone, is not changing. So right now, because of the limitations that septic puts on a property, they might not be able to build out to their potential ground cover even, because you just...
So does ground cover regulations go away?
No, this assumes that those remain in place under this analysis. That's just the constraints of current zoning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we may have glossed over that a little bit too quickly, but the real premise of this is looking at the fact that our current state and local regulations around septic systems restricts the number of bedrooms per lot. So for every 10,000 square foot of lot area, you're allowed 1 bedroom. So it essentially allows 4 bedrooms per acre lot under current septic regulations. So there's certainly an underlying assumption here that the size of the house or building that you're going to construct is going to depend somewhat on how many bedrooms you can put in it. So a lot of these properties maybe have not maxed out their ground cover allowance under zoning or subdivided, even though zoning may allow them to, because they've been limited in a number of bedrooms as a result of the septic systems. So what we've taken a look at, recognizing that the underlying zoning is not going to change. So minimum lot size doesn't change, ground cover allowance does not change. All that's really changing here is the number of bedrooms allowed on a piece of property. So we're really evaluating that as a factor of density and growth and development rather than the number of buildings or the size of the buildings per se. We're really looking at number of bedrooms is the factor or the element that we've asked principal to take a look at for us. So we're really, I think on Nantucket, we more typically think about the ground cover or primary, secondary, tertiary dwellings. And we haven't gotten into that kind of detail here. We're really just working on a basis of bedrooms.
Does that make sense?
Can you go back to that slide where you talked about the types of zoning that could affect this if the community chose to work towards that? There. And what each of those means? I don't know what pattern language is.
Yeah, this, we had a lot of discussion about this over the course of the research. And, I think, I think my recommendation is that you should look at your zoning as being unique to Madaket, because right now it's clear that some of the small cottages, like in this photo, there's potential to change the physical character of the community substantially once the sewer comes in, and that's individual property owners all making individual choices and all, and so as a community, as looking at the whole neighborhood and folks that value it now, we could start to define, well, what is it that is valuable or intrinsically defining for Madaket, and then tailor zoning for that. And then there's a choice around, well, what can be done that maintains that character, and then what should be regulated differently than it is now. And I think we've seen all sorts of zoning where we want to maintain character but allow growth. We want to be able to have our grandkids and have the walk-in bedroom and second bathrooms and all of that, but we want it to still look like it belongs in this neighborhood that's a historic neighborhood. So what we first see is, there's a pattern language. So the pattern, if you look around, you have a tremendous tradition on Nantucket. You just read Building with Nantucket in Mind, of an established kind of building tradition. And, I think that's, many places don't have that, so you're already in a better position to do this type of zoning than many other places are. And it's sort of just respecting that tradition. And that comes to, well, what's the sort of maximum size of the main part of a house, the width and the length. And many zoning codes are starting to establish, rather than using lot coverage, they're actually talking about buildings. Sort of saying, well, we know a normal house in this part of the island might be have 16 to 18 feet wide by 32 to 42 feet long, and some range of that. And if you're going to maintain a pattern, you want to kind of have all the buildings, the various buildings that might be in the community to fit into that pattern or some range of that pattern. So you could go along and start to understand those patterns by literally going out and measuring some of the best buildings throughout the community and start to look at, well, there might be 6 different types of homes or 6 different building types. It's really thinking about it like Legos. Like you have a cottage, you have a bungalow, you have a home, you have a larger home on the waterfront. Like there's these types that might have recurring patterns that you could discern. Then that starts to suggest how you might organize zoning districts. And right now zoning, zoning covers use, covers physical form, and life, health, safety, welfare, starts to protect other sort of social goods. What we're finding is that a lot of zoning codes over time have sort of been, were initially defined to largely handle use, and then have slowly kind of turned towards, the issues around the built environment. And what we find is that, a lot of zoning districts could be tailor-made to align better with the goals of a community and what they are, and where they want to get to. And that gets to defining things more clearly about building placement, not just talking about setbacks, but actually talking about how the building relates to other buildings or how the building relates to the street or to the water, and then how the buildings within its own parcel relate to each other. I think that's the sort of pool pavilion, the shed, the tertiary, secondary, like all of those things could be more tightly coordinated to go back to this, well, what are the patterns we want to maintain or what are the patterns we want to enhance? And then there's things that are even more finite, what we call building components. And these are the shed dormer, the side porch, all the things that get added on to a Nantucket house. Even, the kind of how houses on Nantucket kind of grow and they kind of have these wings and all, like those are different components. And those can be more clearly defined in zoning to be much more predictable. So if someone were to add on to a small 2-bedroom cottage right now in Madaket, how could they do it in a way that would maintain the lovely character of that home, that property, that neighbor, that street, and ultimately the neighborhood? So, and then these last two are fairly straightforward, but the accessory structures are buildings too. So when we see really good zoning codes, they are thinking about the overall composition of the site, how those accessory structures relate to one another, but also how they relate to the overall goal of the neighborhood or that street or the landscape that neighborhood exists in. And then at the bottom here is the use table. And I think that's very simply, thinking about how uses might be placed in the neighborhood or regulated more closely in the neighborhood. So I think, and this is, lots of zoning codes have this, and I think what we've seen is that it comes back to your vision. What is the long-term vision for your community, and does your zoning line up with it? And that's something I think you all should have more discussion about. I could lecture for another hour about zoning if you want me to.
Any other questions or comments?
It's a beautiful Thursday day. I really appreciate everyone coming tonight and listening to this. It's an important, oftentimes very technical thing, but it really has, for us, kind of opened up a lot of questions that we think your community should continue to talk through. So I think you should all tell your neighbors and your friends and make sure this is something that you spend time thinking about and ideally, figure out a way to move forward. So it's been a real pleasure to working with everyone. Thank you again for including us in your kind of discussion. One more question.
One question.
Yeah.
How does this impact the ability of the island to provide water?
I can repeat the question. How does this affect the island's ability to provide water? Maybe Emily could answer that one. I think.
Well, most of Madaket already is supplied with town water, which happened a number of years ago. So this doesn't necessarily have any implications. Town water was brought out to Madaket, and this is really just looking specifically at sewer, the addition of sewer infrastructure.
Under your maximum build-out, what happens to the impervious surfaces and potential for increased runoff? Similar to, is it linear in terms of,
I'll just repeat the question.
Yeah.
So the question was under the maximum build out, how does that relate to impervious surfaces, essentially? Is it compare directly?
Yeah, I think the modeling really is sorry, I'm clicking a lot here. Essentially says, well, if you're going to rebuild or expand your property, the modeling just says you're going to take advantage of all those development rights you have with the maximum ground cover. So that's really the limiting factor right now on impervious surface is your ground cover allowance. Now, I think there are things in your zoning about how they measure porches and pools and all the sort of other things that go into is that impervious or not. And I think how you deal with stormwater is a whole nother sort of layer that could be studied on top of this. And I think that's very much sort of gets to the neighborhood planning of how do you at the parcel level or at the sort of block group or several parcels together coordinate stormwater in a more characteristic fashion. I think that's part of it, is making it fit within the landscape and be an additive to your community rather than something that's detractive, that distracts from it.
Early off of this, you could calculate the maximum ground cover.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
So my question is, do you have a sense of what the blended overall percentage is today? Is it, are we at a couple of percent of of maximum ground cover, or are we at 50% of maximum ground cover, or?
I don't know off the top of my head, but yeah, that's, there's not a data point for each parcel on their percentage of coverage, but, yeah. Yeah, this assumes that every property will build out to their maximum coverage. But what you're asking is, well, where are we at in coverage now versus where we'll get to? Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it seems to me it relates back to water quality. While we may be taking septic out of the equation, you know, if we increase our impervious surfaces, we're going to increase runoff. It's going to find its way to either the groundwater or to bays and estuaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, because I know there wasn't a microphone there, so one of the concerns that was raised was that as this analysis looking at maximum build out potential considers lots building out to their maximum ground cover allowance, that also is naturally going to be an increase in impervious surface, which leads to questions about stormwater management. And I think it's also another point around sort of having some forethought and planning for the future, because as Russ indicated in the beginning, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but happen slowly. And so being able to anticipate what could be coming as far as increase in impervious surfaces and the water quality impacts that will also have on the community. In addition, that's sort of another unintended consequence of some of the additional build out potential that there would be as a result of bringing sewer, that it's important to consider in advance and try to address.
Yeah, and this brings up a different topic, but the stormwater work we've done over the years, the best management practices around basically removing stuff from the stormwater and make sure it doesn't get into the estuaries. I think the state has a very good set of practices. I would imagine, it's been several months since I've read the islands, but I think that is a much more tuned sort of set of regulations. I think we're also seeing people kind of stepping that up even another notch or two with increase in storm surge and storm, other aspects of it. So I think there's a layer here that, you should be paying attention to. But I know there's just like there's good zoning tools, the stormwater tools are even more advanced now, and I think are very, this region is very aware of those. But how impactful, like how much more water flow? No, we have not calculated that. That would be a separate study.
But certainly as sea level rises and groundwater elevation rises, there's less room to put stormwater underground than there used to be. So it's something else that needs to be considered.
Yes, please.
This is all assuming that zoning never changes out there as well.
Correct. That was, yes. The question just for folks online is, this assumes that zoning has not changed. Correct. That was sort of, we fixed the current zoning in place and made some assumptions about.
It could change though.
I like to remind people that zoning is not written in stone, and that zoning, and just I've been doing this long enough that I've seen communities go through the brain damage and heartache to change zoning, and then have it work, and their community gets better. And I think just being able to see that, and communities come together to not fear that change of zoning, but use it as a tool to get their community where they want to go. I think that's something that is something we have to remind everyone. And I think particularly in New England, we have a hard time with it because of how zoning's sort of used, especially in Massachusetts. So I think I would sort of hope everyone thinks zoning is a tool to be changed, and to, just like your phone gets a software update, your zoning is sort of the software that runs how your community gets built. It requires updating more frequently than we really give it credit for.
Well, then that brings me back to the question with zoning. What input do we as neighbors have if we wanted stricter zoning? How do we determine zoning? Because we have a zoning enforcement on the island that has zoning that leads more towards development. And maybe we would like to have stricter zoning so there would be less. But do we have any input?
No, I mean, I think zoning, I mean, we are fortunate that with home rule and the way zoning can be changed in Massachusetts, that you do. And I think it has to come down to organizing around what is that new zoning going to accomplish.
So if the neighbors or the residents of Madaket group together and have a consensus of what they feel zoning they would like to see be established prior to sewer coming in, are we listened to? Is that considered?
No, I mean, it's a town meeting vote on Nantucket for 2/3 town meeting vote. So a supermajority to change zoning is what it usually takes. So, and I think, there's a, the larger discussion around zoning is I always think the vision for a place needs to lead. Because if you've established a real clear vision where people can understand, well, what is this place going to look, feel, function like in 20, 30, 40 years, and then you can show folks, yes, that's what I want. I feel like that's what I want. And then you can say, well, is the zoning getting you or not? Then if it's not getting you there or it's not doing what you want to accomplish that vision, then it's much, much easier to bring people around a change of zoning. And it goes back to the comment about zoning being in stone, is people, it's a tool we have to learn how to use. And so yes, you would have to come together as a community and really campaign for that type of change.
Well, then that brings me to another question in mind. The elephant in the room. We have a commercial restaurant in Madaket, and the only tool we have for a restriction is the septic allows 124 seats. And that restaurant is pushing for more seating, always, and not really abiding by what the septic tells them that they are allowed. So then you remove septic, and you have sewer. Do they have 500 seats? Now,
Yes.
there's an impact in the neighborhood that right now we have the tool of the septic system giving them some sort of restriction.
Yeah, I think you're making my point more elegantly, is there are particular
I don't know
issue.
how eloquent that is, but it's
No,
the
but
truth.
that if you start to look at individual parcels, like the restaurant that I've been to several times, and you're going to discover that there's some planning that's needed to think through each of these situations and how it might unfold. And then, I mean, life is unpredictable, but we have zoning that can make your neighborhood more predictable. Why would you not use that tool to sort of guide your community where you want to go? So I think, get together, have some conversations, make a plan, and then figure out, well, what's the zoning got to change to make that plan possible?
So, Jocelyn Duffy, I have a few questions
course.
here. First of all, is the sewer funded already? Is that a guarantee? Is it a priority? Secondly, maybe the IA septic system would limit the building and keep the character the way it is, not change the zoning or increase it for more dense population. And thirdly, if we go through with this sewer and we want to keep the character of Madaket, who decides? I mean, what committees in the town, and how do the people organize?
Three-part question.
So, okay, first question was, is it funded?
Emily, you want to take that one?
What about the IA system to keep the character the way it is, because you're not going to change the density? And thirdly, if the sewer does go through and we want to change the zoning, how are we going to do? Is it strictly the town's influence? Do the people have any influence?
So sewer hasn't been officially funded. That's still to come. As far as changes that would be made, the MCA, the Madaket Association, is currently working on updating the area plan. And I think that as the discussion that just took place with Ms. Johnson, there's absolutely opportunity for the neighborhood to gather together and have some discussions, create a vision around what changes they might want to see. And I think often, maybe not always, but often when there's a neighborhood or a group that goes to town meeting with a proposed zoning change with a lot of community support for it, then the rest of the island tends to support them in that change. I think that there is definitely a lot of opportunity for the Madaket residents to participate in those discussions around
Okay.
what changes are.
So if
Are
the sewer
appropriate.
is not funded currently, is it a priority to fund the sewer? And would you consider IA systems, which in my understanding is less expensive than a sewer? It's first priority
Right. So
on that list of, funding. And our is IA an alternative?
So the Madaket has been designated a needs area, so it technically is a priority of the towns to sewer. The IA systems are currently required, but it's certainly dependent upon when sewer is eventually brought out to Madaket. That's a discussion that has been ongoing with the town, but sewer has been prioritized for Madaket.
Is it a number one priority, or are there other priorities in Nantucket?
Well, there are a number of needs areas. As far as which one is at the top of the list right now, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question directly, but it is at the top of the list. I don't know if anyone else here wants to comment on that or not, but
Let me say it a different way and see if I'm getting your question right. The environmental goals around the sewer, I think, is essential, and just knowing the conversation that has occurred over time on the Cape with it, that your ability as a community to have sewer is unique, and that will that's sort of an opportunity to solve some of these environmental concerns that a lot of places in the region are not able to do. So I think that it's a needs area, it's prioritized. I'm not as familiar with where the sort of infrastructure is going as far as the island, but I think as a community, one of the compelling reasons when I go out there is the beautiful landscape and your water and all, like that's something you need to probably fix sooner rather than later, and the sewer is part of that fix, as is the IA systems and improving the septic. Mm-hmm. So those are both should happen. I think it's how quickly they can
It's
happen.
how quickly and how expensive it is. That's the key,
Right.
right? I mean, there might be other priorities in Nantucket before the sewer. It's a financial problem as well,
Right.
Leslie.
Right.
I'm not sure how much clarity I can throw on this, but I can say that the Madaket Conservation Association is staying in touch with Emily and with the town manager and the sewer director to keep our finger on where sewer to Madaket falls in the priority list. At this point, I'm not sure we would be the first sewer line being installed, because IA systems, mining the landfill, other things are helping with the TMDL requirements for total maximum daily load nitrogen in Long Pond and Hither Creek. So some of those other methods are helping, but there's a lot of inputs into this. But you're correct, the town has many priorities, including those from the Coastal Resiliency Plan, which put a bullseye right on downtown. Not for sewer, but for flooding.
well, and then also along those same lines, I do know that the town has been having discussions about the infrastructure needed to sewer Madaket, and also trying to coordinate with that with improved infrastructure relative to coastal resilience and the roads heading out there. So I think they're in the process right now of taking a closer look at how those things could be coordinated, and so how that affects the prioritization of sewer to Madaket. We're waiting to see. But this really, when we started looking at this question that the Madaket community had been asking for a number of years, it seemed as though sewer to Madaket was much closer to a number one priority. And so we really wanted to get a better understanding of, if sewer was coming, what additional implications were there that the community should be talking about and trying to bring to the rest of the island and to town meeting to address some of these other concerns. So exactly where Madaket falls in the priority list of the town right now, I'm not 100% sure, but it's still up there somewhere. And so the purpose of this was to try to flesh out some of those additional questions and concerns.
And I think just to, if business as usual, where you don't have sewer coming and it's not clear, there might not be really any need to change zoning. You can see the kind of parcels that have the potential for change here are quite small. But I think it was the fact that, a lot of parcels lit up when we did this analysis that said, okay, if sewer is coming and we know when it's coming, then there's some need to have these discussions to properly prepare for it, to coordinate. I think this is something you shouldn't be fearful of, because lots of communities have coordinated infrastructure projects with land use. And I think it's just acknowledging that we have to do it and saying, okay, well, when sewer we know it's going to get turned on at this date. Okay, well, then we should start to think about how we coordinate our land use around it.
So
Please.
I'm the big bad sewer guy.
Super.
I'm David Gray, I'm the sewer director.
Welcome, David.
Madaket at one point in time was #1 priority, based off of the water quality and the TMDLs and everything like that. That's kind of changed, because the levels have come down, the water's improving. Yeah, is it perfect yet? No, but it has improved. So does Madaket #1 at this point in time? It's still very high on the list, but not necessarily. It all depends on, you got sea level rise coming. I don't see any of the maps showing anything about potential sea level rise and on showing where water might end up coming
We
into it.
have that map, right? I feel like we do have.
There's another thing that I don't hear any discussion on is the Massachusetts Title V regulations are changing. Big time changing, and it could affect every single person who has a septic system. And you're talking in excess of $100,000 for a Title V system. On Nantucket, probably closer to $150,000. So those are all taking place and behind the scenes, and I've met with a lot of people in this room over time. The one thing with Madaket that has changed, that really adds a lot to the price tag, is the coastal resiliency piece, because every project we do on Nantucket, no matter what it is, sewer, water, stormwater, it ends up turning into a paving project. And asphalt on Nantucket is extremely expensive. And some top numbers that we've heard or whatever, you could be looking upwards of almost $100 million just to take in sewer Madaket, because it's going to cost maybe $50 million to pave and rebuild the bridges and everything else. So there's a lot of those factors that we're taking into consideration in some of the designs and stuff that we've looked at. Like Emily had said, with the higher the water gets, the less land there is. Any design we do will be valved so that it can be disconnected, shut off, taken out without affecting the rest of the system. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of group talks with people that we're trying to look at all the factors. If this was to ever go forward, by the time it's designed, constructed, turned on and everything, you're probably talking a minimum of 5 years before the first toilet was ever flushed, from the time the design was approved and bid out. So you're talking 2028, 2030, possibly before the first toilet could ever flush in Madaket. With the way we can only work in the winters, we can't work year round. We're finding that out now with the large force main project we're doing now. That's starting in a few weeks. So there's been a lot of these pieces are being all talked about. I talk a lot with Steve from the Board of Health and whatnot like that, of what could come, what couldn't come. So we're looking at a lot of it. And I mean, some of our numbers when we did our master plan only showed that there would be a net increase of 171 bedrooms in Madaket, based off of the numbers that we did back in 2020. So, I was born and raised here. If we ever see 3-story buildings here, I'll be surprised. So, I mean, there's places at the other end of the island right now that have anywhere from 14 to 18 bathrooms and 14 to 18 bedrooms. So, and it's been an interesting time the past few years over the big projects that I've done since I took my role in 2016. So, I'm looking out for the water quality, but I'm also looking out for Nantucket. It's you have to. I know many people in this room. I've grown up with most of these people in this room, so it's Nantucket weighs heavy on my shoulders. So I just wanted to say that that we're looking at everything. I mean, I've worked over the years with Emily and everything, so it's not like we're just going to say, guess what? Here comes sewer next week. you're looking 5 years or more, easy, before
Right.
any toilet will ever flush. So.
Plenty
there's a
of
lot-
time to work on zoning.
And you have plenty of time to work. I mean, it's not like, it's gonna come soon enough. It's, we have landfill leachate to look at. We have, coastal resiliency. How are we gonna even get the sewer pipes into town without the fear of flooding? I mean, are we gonna have to rebuild the culverts over, First and Second Bridge? Absolutely. Do we have to raise the roads? It's all that stuff gets looked at as part of the whole puzzle, so.
Right.
We're working very closely with everybody. So, but I'm just a big bad sewer guy, and I just wanted to just. So,
You,
but
David, thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
You
thank you,
are,
David.
you are
Appreciate
not
it.
the big bad sewer guy.
Steve's a big bad guy.
Definitely appreciate that, David. There are absolutely a lot of variables locally and at the state level. He's right. Some of the regulatory changes that the state's looking at with septic systems will definitely come into play on Nantucket. So thank you, David.
Hi, I'm Brooke Moore, and I'm on the select board. I'm on the Big Bad Select Board. This was fascinating to me. When I saw this come up, this was going on, I learned a lot. What I can say in my time in my involvement in town government is time is your friend. Use it wisely. Get together. Create a vision. And I think you kept using the word vision.
Mm-hmm.
Understand what the potential negative outcomes are that you want to address and create a positive vision for what you want to see. And the community will rally with you if you present them not an opposition to something, but a positive outlook, given all the factors of coastal resilience, sewering, water quality, landfill, all of it. Come up with a vision for the Madaket you love and you want to see 20, 30 years from now, and convince the community. And then how can you protect it through changes in land use, and come up with a plan for that, and then bring the community along. And I think you will get support for that, because people love Madaket. I love Madaket. I don't live there, but I use the water all the time out there, and it's precious to me. Mm-hmm. And I think what this gentleman is telling you is get involved and plan now, because if it's required by the town that we sewer Madaket and we have to make that investment, you need to be prepared and have done the groundwork to prevent the unintended consequences that were presented to us today. And so that's work now, plan ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well said.
Yeah, well said, Brooke. Thank you. Anyone else?
I have one other thought. So, when the big bad sewer guy mentioned, or somebody mentioned $150,000 to have an upgraded IA system, and if the sewer is not going to happen for 5 years or 8 years, and then everybody that fails whatever the new Title V is subjected to that, that's a lot of money for individual homeowners to spend, knowing that sewer is coming in 5 years or 7 years. So I don't know how that piece works.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. And I see Steve Visco getting up. Thank you. I was wondering if you might want to address that.
Board of Health. We gave a time frame. If the sewer does come to Madaket and you have an IA system in the ground, I believe it's 15 years from the certificate of compliance of when it was installed. So if you did it just 5 years before, if the sewer comes out 5, you wouldn't have to connect to, say, like 10 years. Because we know you put out such an exorbitant amount of money to do what we ask, do what we ask you to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the Board of Health has been working to try to address that issue as well.
Well, again, thank you all for coming. I mean, what I would encourage you to do is, everyone's been talking about this, it seems like, but I think it starts with people. I mean, what I've more and more come to realize, especially through COVID and all the planning we did with communities during the pandemic, was the plan's not going to move forward unless the people are moving it forward. So I think, what your select board member here mentioned is important. Get together. When we start planning a neighborhood or a community or a downtown, we literally say, well, who can we meet with at their kitchen table and get 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 people together and just talk about it over a meal and start to establish an ongoing dialogue that will lead to bigger and bigger things. And I think it can be a fun and exciting thing to do together as a community if you do it right. And it's not something you have to fear. And I think you have plenty of time, as we heard, to do it and do it properly. So, and there's a lot of issues that you're susceptible to. So it's something that, as kind of custodians of this part of the island right now, you should do for those future generations as well. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.